You might not make it.
Okay. Can you hear me? We got mics? Oh, there we go. We took a minute to warm up. Good evening, everyone. I think we're just about ready to begin. My name is Teresa Jacobs, and I'm with the League of Women Voters and with the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center. I was not going to be the moderator this evening, so please bear with me. The influenza is in the household of the person who is going to. So I'll be serving as the moderator this evening, and on behalf of everyone who made this forum possible, I welcome you and thank you for coming. Being Veterans Day, we would like to acknowledge and honor our citizen soldiers who have loyally served our country, and we are joining them this evening in the common commitment to protect our democracy, our precious democracy. Tonight's forum is entitled Democracy at Risk, a conversation on media, government, and the role of citizens. In an ideal democracy, we might be able to claim the citizens are fully informed about government issues and aware of how the media is presenting that information and are ready to make decisions. Our topic this evening arises out of concerns by forum sponsors that we are not close to achieving that ideal in this country. The intent of this forum is to discover how we might enhance the practical capacity of citizens to get the kind of complete information and accurate information they need in order to make millions of important decisions. Is democracy at risk? It is a pretty provocative question, and we asked it in order to elicit questions and critical thinking. And at any point in this evening, if any of the panelists feel like tackling that question, feel free to. The sponsors of this forum include the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center, the Practical Ethics Center, and the Missoula League of Women Voters. A videotape of this forum will be shown on MCAT on Sunday, November 16th from 3 to 5 p.m. and again on the 26th of November from 4:30 to 6:30. In addition, there will be a handout at the door when you leave that has that information on it, as well as a bibliography of references we make during this forum and other resources that you can find on the web. Our guests this evening are citizens who have intimate knowledge of the media from different perspectives, and we are honored to have them join us. Denny Elliott is a professor and the director of UM's Practical Ethics Center, where she has been conducting research and teaching courses such as ethical journalism since 1996. A prolific writer, she has produced innumerable books, articles, and documentaries on subjects such as defining and analyzing journalistic deception. She has also worked as a newspaper and radio columnist, a reporter, and an editor for publications. She is the recipient of many awards and has held many positions at different universities. We are lucky to have her with us today, as she will be leaving Missoula soon to take a position in Florida.
I can't keep a job.
I don't think that's it. We also have Dick Manning with us this evening. He is a prolific and award-winning author whose 7th book is now in publication. He writes on subjects such as logging, prairie lands, rivers, rainforests, and agriculture. Before he began writing books, Dick worked as an editor and reporter for 15 years at newspapers in Montana and southern Idaho. He has received numerous awards, including awards for investigative journalism, and he has degrees in political science and journalism and lives in Lolo, Montana. Clem Work has been a professor of journalism at this university since 1990. He heads the graduate program and teaches courses such as media law and reporting. Before that, he worked as the senior editor for U.S. News and World Report and served as deputy director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press in Washington, D.C. He began his journalism career working for daily newspapers in California and Denver in the 1960s before getting his law degree in 1975. He is currently working on a book about the Wobblies, did I say that? Which is about the suppression of dissent and the origins of free speech in Montana. Again, we thank all of you for joining us this evening. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Our format this evening will include brief presentations of information followed by questions and answers in a give and take between the panelists. It will be my job to weave in questions from the audience that are written on cards as part of creating a continuous conversation. So I hope when you came in you were able to pick up cards and pencils, and as soon as you have a question you can just pass it to the side aisle here, and the spotters will come and pick up your questions and bring it to Mike Custodia and Jane Ragsdale here in the front, who are going to be trying to find questions that we already are not asking and so forth, and we'll try and weave those in as we can and include as many as possible, especially if they're very succinct. So I wanted to share a quote by James Madison, and we have this real high-tech system here. There we go. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power knowledge gives. Our democracy hinges on the complex relationship of media, the government, and citizens. Citizens get their information from the media, who in turn rely on the government to protect and provide access to information. For the system to work, each partner in this triad must do their share of the work in good faith. So tonight we're going to focus on each of the partners in turn. First, we'll focus on citizens who are charged with getting what Madison calls the popular information needed for self-governance. Then we'll look at the professional media, which is the core of reporters, writers, editors, publishers, news anchors, commentators, and media owners charged with providing timely and accurate information to the public in a thorough and honest way. And finally, we'll be looking at elected and appointed government officials who have vowed to uphold the law and the Constitution, including the Freedom of the Press, Freedom of Information Act, and antitrust protections. And at the end of this forum, we'll have time for synthesis and questions from the audience that you'll be able to ask directly. Before we go to our panelists, we want to kind of discover who we are in this room and how we as citizens are getting our information before we look at how other people across the country are. So we're going to have an unscientific straw poll here if you'd like to participate. All you need to do is raise your hand. So if you could just raise your hand if you do something daily. Excuse me just a second. I meant to turn on this video for the sake of recording this, because we are going to be airing this. We'll be able to cut this part. Okay. So please raise your hand if on a weekly basis you do something to get local, national, or international news. Okay, most everybody. And now, if you could just raise your hand to say where you are getting most of your news from. So do you get most of your news from, and you can see it up there on the board, local newspapers such as the Missoulian and the Independent? Other newspapers, magazines, or newsletters? Local and national public radio programs? Local and national commercial radio stations? We're finding out who we are here. The evening news on local television stations? News and issues programs on national public television? Internet news sources? Cable and satellite news sources? And conversations with family and friends. Okay, wow. Thank you very much. Oh, one more thing. Let's see. How many people think that TV, radio, and newspapers in this community are really plugged into our community? How many think that you are really plugged into your community in terms of involvement? It's recorded forever. Okay. So now let's compare ourselves with other Americans and where they're getting their news. Up here on the monitor, and oops, let's see, we can bring it up here on the main one too. Just a second. So in 1998, can you see? Yeah, on the computer. Oh, I see. We can only do one at a time. Okay, there you go. Sorry about that. In 1998, Pew Research reported that nearly 60% of Americans got their news from network television broadcasts. In the same year, Gallup Research also reported that television was the most common source of news, followed by local newspapers. So this graph actually here shows research that was done in March of 2000, just before U.S. military invasion of Iraq. And it shows that television was still the most common source of news, followed by newspapers, radio, and the internet. Cable, and another report shows that cable news was higher than network news. And among internet users, the 17% who got most of their news from the web also got most of their news that, there was an increase from 3% a year and a half earlier in September of 2001. I was getting mixed up. There was another report that also shows that for internet users, many of them also get their primary news still from television news. So now we are turning to our panelists finally and asking for comment on these various journalistic formats and how they contribute to the quality of news being transmitted to the public, if you would. And whoever would like to go first.
Well, okay, I'll start. It's true that we are faced with an incredible range of options today as citizens and the way in which we can gather information. And you look back at our so-called legacy media, and what are the names that come to mind? Well, way back, Gazette, Bulletin, things like that, newspapers. Today, we have words like blogs, cells, Palm Pilots. These are new forms of not only communication, but access to news. So, yes, there is an incredible range of tools and ways of accessing information. That's all good, but that's not necessarily the entire story. Digital access, for example, the internet, the people who had the highest hopes for the small d democratization value of the internet, that is, that it would transcend all barriers to media, have come to the realization that the internet is not living up to its potential. It's being routinized and it's being consolidated and it's being channeled by big media in a lot of different ways that we have yet to begin to appreciate. So this great medium that we thought we had may well turn out not to fulfill its promise in some ways. So that's a challenge for all of us as citizens, is to make sure that this medium and any other media that come along are in fact as democratic as possible in the sense of assuring us access and as much equal access as possible to information. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you.
And I agree with Clem that that's where this discussion is going to end up focusing, and that's where our future lies, and things like the internet. When we see the statistics we saw here on the numbers, it's a focus, or it's a snapshot of the past. It's a snapshot of decay. And it really doesn't ask what's very interesting about what's happening, what's evolving very rapidly on the internet especially. But when we say that 21% of the people get their news from newspapers now, that's another way of saying that, what, 79% of Americans are ignorant. And that's about right, I think. And the reason that our culture is in decline. And that is the measure of that decline, but what is really interesting is the forces that are evolving now to take us out of that picture of decline.
I'm going to actually kind of break ranks on some of this stuff in that I know that Teresa said that we're going to sort of talk in turn about media, citizens, government. And my problem is that I have a hard time separating those three concepts. I mean, certainly, you can perceive yourselves as citizens and as not as members of the media or not as a government leader, but all three are so interdependent that I'm going to end up doing some things this evening to kind of draw that all together. I guess the other thing that I want to say is I'm in the process of producing a magazine article right now on this very topic, so I'm looking forward to gaining from you information to help me better integrate the important roles that all three play. I'm really delighted to be here, and I guess with maybe my swan song in Missoula. I mean, when Teresa asked you the questions, I mean, all of you listen to NPR and nobody watches television, local television news. I mean, do you know how much that puts you out of the mainstream of general public in America? That's one of the reasons that while I'm taking this job in Florida, I'm not really moving, I'm only commuting. I'm going to keep my home here. But I want to actually sort of do another poll. And that's really all I'm going to do with this piece of it. And then as we go through the questions, I'll expand somewhat on why I'm asking and what I think is important about it. But for this poll, I need you to sort of step back in time. I want you to think about the first week in September. It was a dramatic week in Missoula, as you might remember. Some early rain ended the worst fire season we had had in 15 years. If you had been called by a pollster during that time and hadn't hung up on her thinking that she was a telemarketer, this was before the October 1 no-call date started, you might have been asked some questions regarding connections between Saddam Hussein and the attacks of 9/11. So kind of put yourself back there early in September, and I want to ask you how you would have answered these questions then. All right, I'm going to ask you two questions, and here are your choices. You can agree, disagree, or vote not sure. This is what you thought at the time. 1, Saddam Hussein was involved with the attacks of 9/11, either directly or indirectly. How many of you agree with this is what you thought then? How many of you disagree? How many of you would say you were not sure in September? Okay? Now think back further. Back to February of 2003. American young men and women were being sent to Kuwait in preparation for the Iraqi invasion. The UN was condemning U.S. action while simultaneously calling its inspectors home and abandoning its posts in Iraq. Worldwide anti-war protests were mentioned by the mainstream U.S. media only in passing. So think back to February 2003, just before the invasion in Iraq. And I would like you to think about how you would have answered those same questions then. 1, Saddam Hussein was involved with the attacks of 9/11 either directly or indirectly. At that time, how many of you would say that you agreed with that statement? Okay, handful more, a couple more. And second one, or that was agree, sorry. How many of you would have disagreed with that in February of 2003? And how many of you had said you were not sure in 2003, February 2003? Okay? Some or all of the hijackers on 9/11 were Iraqi. And again, what did you think February 2003? How many of you would have agreed with that statement then? No one? Oh boy, just wait. No. How many of you would have disagreed with that statement? How many of you would have then said you weren't sure? Great.
Okay, thank you. And we have a follow-up question for Clem. Could you please elaborate on this is from the audience. Could you please elaborate in which which big businesses is channeling internet news? And also, for any or all of you, your thoughts on taxation of the internet access.
I didn't quite get the question, Teresa.
Could Clem elaborate on the ways in which big business is channeling internet news?
Okay. One way is that you may be familiar with the concept of net portals, places where people ordinarily go to find, they may use it as their home page, or they may go as a place to start looking for information. Well, a lot of those portals are operated by big media, whether it's a network, whether it's CNN, AOL, Time Warner. Practically all of those portals are owned by giant media. So that's one example. Another one, which maybe gets a little more complicated, is that the architecture of broadband media, which means high-speed access to the internet, is being transformed from the pull to the push. This means a loss of control by those who are consumers, readers, gatherers of news, and more toward the television model of people who are passive receivers of information. Instead of asking for it, you get it from another because somebody thinks you like it, thinks you want it. Okay, so those are ways in which large corporations, media conglomerates, are controlling the way in which people gather information through this medium of the internet.
Okay, thank you. And this is a question, your thoughts on taxation of internet access. In parentheses, there seems to be expiration of a 5-year ban on such taxation. So is anybody familiar with that? Okay.
I'm against it, but
Okay, okay, we'll go on.
To a degree, but you can elaborate on, and the same thing in response, the same answer to what Clem just said is that, yeah, all these things are happening on the internet, but so what? They're so blasted easy to circumvent that you do it in about 5 seconds. So you have a tremendous amount of control to get around. That's why they can't tax it, because nobody can ever figure out what you're doing on it long enough. And that's why they can't control access through portals, because you can slip it. I mean, not just here. I've been in China twice in the last couple of years and watched what's happening in China as a result of the internet. And if the Chinese government can't control its citizens' access to the internet, ours isn't going to do much better at it.
Okay, all right.
can I just elaborate
please, yeah.
on that a little bit? I was talking to Dick about this example that I think is a very interesting development in the way in which citizens can utilize the internet for democratic purposes. Diebold, is anybody familiar with the name Diebold? They make not only safes, but they also make electronic voting machines. They are the biggest beneficiaries of a bill passed by Congress to reform voting laws in the wake of the 2000 Florida fiasco. But as electronic voting takes hold, more and more people are concerned about the integrity of the electronic voting process. The fact that, for example, it's possible to manipulate the software so that whatever you vote doesn't come out that way, okay? Concerns about that were communicated through emails and other messages that were collected on a website operated by Diebold, but available to the public. Those were downloaded initially by activist students at colleges, but then by other groups. Diebold, in turn, is trying to use recently passed copyright laws to crack down or basically to suppress the use of this information by citizens to question the integrity of the voting process. In return, the student activists who initially downloaded this information have now engaged in a national process of cyber disobedience by making sure that this information is basically the same process of file sharing that is used for music, by transferring these files and spreading these files and propagating them so that they can never be suppressed. Okay, I mean, I think it's a brilliant example of the way in which citizens can use the internet to take control of the democratic process. But on the other hand, Diebold's use of the Copyright Act is also a frightening new development of the way in which, in this case, a corporation can use laws to suppress public debate about an issue that is central to the democratic process. So I think that's just a fascinating new development.
Okay, all right, thanks. We're going to move on here, and if you would like to put questions in writing, we're filtering them through here and trying to float them in. I don't know if you were here. Actually, we're going to move on. So sorry. And our next topic is a focus on the media. It's going to be hard just to focus on it, maybe, but we're going to try. And it may look like we're being kind of hard on the media tonight, and that's not the intention. And we don't want to seem to be bashing it all. It's because journalism is so critically important to our democracy that we're risking, engaging in critical assessment of what's happening in the journalistic medium. And so I just want to make that clear, that we understand the commitment of journalists to the service to the citizenry. And there are many ethical codes that guide and lend credibility to journalists in their work, and a copy of one of them is over here in a large copy. It's the Code of Ethics for the Society of Professional Journalism. The main headings, if you can't see them, and it's more there, it's just a document, just because it's so, to me, enlightening, is seek truth, report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable. Under the be accountable part, explicitly, journalists are to avoid conflicts of interest, staging of events, favoring treatment, they're supposed to avoid favored treatment or influence over news coverage by advertisers and special interests. Journalists are to be accountable to their readers, listeners, viewers, and to each other, and to encourage the public to voice grievances against the news media. And finally, to expose unethical practices of journalists and the news media. So just this week, actually, the publication is called The Week. The November 14th issue just arrived, and there was an assessment of journalism by a journalist. There's actually two parts. One was Frank Rich in the New York Times. He said, "The truth is no longer the point. Over the past 2 decades, journalism has slowly morphed into show business, and news has become just another flavor of entertainment, caught in a ratings war, the search for profits, and ego gratification." It goes on to say, quoting Jonathan Chait in the New Republic, "Most journalists really do report the facts, or at least make a good effort to do so. But while they usually get the facts straight, reporters while they usually get the facts straight, reporters routinely get the story wrong." I just think that's so important. That's why I flubbed up on that. Much of the coverage of the nation's biggest public policy issues such as the war on terrorism and the future of Social Security, is muddled and superficial, with the real story lost in the competing spins of warring Republicans and Democrats. Out of concern for objectivity, reporters pass along factoid speeches and blatant falsehoods as news, and settle for simple, entertaining storylines scripted by the professional spinmeisters. Reality, meanwhile, goes largely unexplored. So now we will turn to our panelists and ask, what do you make of these assessments? Beyond whether you agree or not, can you offer any insights about the sources of this expressed dissatisfaction? Anybody?
I'd like to start, just because nobody else said anything. Why not? The idea of the media show business is key, and that transition has occurred. There's no doubt about it. The train has left the station, and that now the national press especially is engaged in the business of entertainment, of pandering to the panic society, which we've become, the culture of panic. There's a really good discussion of that on applies in the national level in Harper's I try to give you a date here, October of 2003 by Gene Lyons, and it's a review, and it's fascinating stuff. But I want to talk about a bifurcation in the press, and I'll use the term press, and I'm old enough to do that. Plus, I'm a print guy, and I have already said that broadcast news is not news. I worry about the press, and I want to talk about what happened to local newspapers, because I think it's crucial when we talk about the idea of responsibility here. Who can fix this? That's what we keep coming back to. And I think that the onus for fixing this rests on people, citizens, because the press has no interest in fixing it any longer. And the reason it doesn't is something that's transition that occurred over about 20 years. And I'll posit this, that 20 years ago's newspaper used to do journalism. That's where journalism resided. That's when I worked there at Papers, and I know it resided there. And over the course of 20 years, something interesting happened, that journalism got separated from the body, from newspapers. What happened was it was part of the consumer culture. At the same time that we stopped being citizens and started being consumers, this began to happen. And it happened in conjunction with the suburbanization of America. Newspapers paid their bills for a very long time with advertising. Somebody at the shoe store bought an ad, and that kept my salary paid as a reporter. And it was an imperfect relationship, but it always had, what we sold to that advertiser was the integrity of the paper, saying, if you'll read this paper, here's something valid, people are going to want to see it every day. It's good journalism because citizens read it. Therefore, it was value to that advertiser. What happened was corporations got into the big box store movement that's taken over this city like any other city in the country right now. Something called preprint advertising occurred, which means the corporation printed up these colorful circulars in mainstream or main factories and trucked them out to newspapers, and it undercut those newspapers' revenues to the point that newspapers had to figure out some way to get by. At the same time, they were doing readership surveys that suggested that you, the public, didn't care what was in your paper so much. In fact, paid as much attention to the advertising and bought the paper for as much as the advertising as you did the journalism. So it occurred to them they no longer had to sell journalism, they sold their distribution systems. All they really had to do is get that circular in front of you every day. And a formula arose very quickly in newspaper management that said if you gut your newsroom and you don't spend any money on this, and simply make sure that you attract the marginal reader through anything that will attract the marginal reader, and that turned out to be information about stars, whether you buy a Lexus or the Cadillac SUV, that kind of thing that now passes for news stories. If you'll look at the paper for that, that distribution system was good enough. Okay? So no longer did newspapers have the income stream to support journalism. At the same time, the internet came online and stole their advertising in real estate and classifieds, which were huge sources of income. And they had to further cut corners and figure out ways how to cut back. As a result of all of this, that journalism kind of left the body. The soul went away to drift off in the ether someplace. And that's the point we are now, is to decide in the local level, can we get the soul back into the citizenry in some way?
I'd like to pick up on what Dick said, because basically he's provided you the why for the what that I'm going to talk about here. And I'm going to pick up on the poll that I did earlier. Because it was this fall, September 18, 2003, where President Bush said for the first time publicly that there is no evidence linking Saddam Hussein to the attacks of 9/11. This must have been confusing to the 70% of Americans polled who believed in that connection. The president's statement that Hussein was not involved was certainly surprising to me, as it was President Bush and the White House staff who intentionally created that misunderstanding in the first place. And again, this is a little dissection of how government, press, and citizen go together. Beginning in September 1999, the Bush administration worked to link Saddam Hussein to the terrorist attacks of 9/11. The White House then speechwriter David Frum said that his assignment, as of September 12th, was for the State of the Union address to extrapolate from September 11th terrorist attacks and make a case for going after Iraq. Frum wrote, and Bush said in the State of the Union address, and the news media repeated in January 2002, quote, Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. States like this and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil. Remember that term? Arming to threaten the peace of the world. The United States will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons. We can't stop short. If we stop now, leaving terror camps intact and terror states unchecked, our sense of security would be false and temporary. That was from that State of the Union address. The subtle and sometimes not so subtle linking of Saddam Hussein with 9/11 continued throughout other speeches in 2002 and was reinforced in the State of the Union address of 2003. This time, Bush said, and this Congress and the American people must recognize another threat. Evidence from intelligence sources, secret communications, and statements by people now in custody reveal that Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members of al-Qaeda. Before September the 11th, many in the world believed that Saddam Hussein could be contained. Again, see that connection. But chemical agents, lethal viruses, and a shadowy terrorist network are not easily contained. Imagine those 19 hijackers with other weapons and other plans, this time armed by Saddam Hussein. It would take one vial, one canister, one crate slipped into this country to bring a day of horror like none we have ever known. We will do everything in our power to make sure that day never comes. President Bush often mentioned both the 9/11 attacks and Saddam Hussein in the same sentence without directly saying that Hussein was involved with those attacks, and the rhetoric worked. A Knight Ridder poll in January of 2003 found that 44% of those asked thought that most or all of the hijackers on 9/11 were Iraqi. The true answer is none. A New York Times CBS poll in February of 2003, so I asked you to think back, found that 72% of those asked thought it was very or somewhat likely that Saddam Hussein played a direct role in the 9/11 attacks. By the Washington Post poll in August 2003, the number who believed in this untrue statement stayed steady at 70%. The Bush administration was wrong to spread that disinformation, but the American news media were even more wrong in allowing the false governmental claims to stand without challenge. Web sources are plentiful regarding the misleading connection made by the administration, but when administration claims were reported in print and broadcast, they stood unchallenged. So just as a review, how many of you knew the correct answers to both questions in September? Saddam was not involved. The hijackers were not Iraqi. Please see your hands. You can be proud. Okay. How many of you knew that way back in February? Answer to both questions. Excellent. But before you get too smug, here's a new question. How many of you called up a news organization, take your pick, to protest them running stories that repeated these administration claims without also reporting that the claims were not true? Huh? Writing letters? Okay, at least you wrote a letter. Journalists and citizens have known for 50 years that the job of journalism is to set the record straight, to make sure that governmental lies are not allowed to stand unchallenged. In 1954, Senator Joe McCarthy showed himself to be a capable manipulator of news media. He reported his charges and lies just before the 5 p.m. deadline. That's when TV news and morning newspapers were generally put to bed. We used to have something like a news cycle that wasn't 24 hours. Holding press conferences at that point in the day is what used to be called a news cycle, didn't give journalists a chance to get response from those that McCarthy called communists in our midst. Most news organizations simply repeated the politicians' lies. The statements were too dramatic from an individual, too powerful to simply ignore. More than one journalist quit the business out of principle. They wouldn't be part of these unwarranted character assassinations. One brave journalistic team working in the brand new medium of television documentary exposed and discredited Senator McCarthy. Then other journalists felt safe to follow Edward R. Murrow's lead. This was a shining moment in American journalism. What's sad is that there are senior journalists today, working today, who were working then or who were inspired as children by the journalists who won the McCarthy war against the godless Reds. Never again, they said, would journalists be a conduit for governmental lies. In a meaningful way, journalism, as the fourth estate in a democratic country, was really born then.
So, Jenny, do you think that you could sum that up just a little bit so we can give Clem a chance to,
Okay.
to speak
All right,
to that?
yeah. Okay,
issue?
my final point on this is that allowing journalism to become what Dick has said it is, and rightly, putting entertainment and marketing values over news is simply wrong. It would be like saying it's okay for doctors and hospitals to recommend unneeded treatments because those unneeded treatments added to their profit. It would be like saying it's okay for doctors and hospitals to refuse to treat difficult patients who are too sick because it's easier for them to do the other stuff. It's not okay.
Denny, I am shocked that you are implying that, or stating that the news media is still subject to manipulation.
Still, again.
And that's only one of its many faults. We don't even have enough time to discuss all of the faults. Concentration, the so-called questions of bias, ethical problems. You know, making stuff up, getting stuff wrong, revealing stuff that people don't want to be revealed. Those are big issues with the public. Giving lip service to the news and other major problems that obviously we don't have time to discuss. But I want to get back to the point that Dick was talking about and look at it from a slightly different angle. I think that another major problem with local news coverage has to do with the business of news coverage these days and the way that it is being taken over by corporations who are, with publicly held shares, who are answerable to Wall Street analysts who are basically trying to satisfy Wall Street analysts with the bottom line, and therefore have a short-sighted view of their mission. It has nothing to do, or very little to do, with the news. It has to do with maximizing the profit and making sure that the profit rises every year. So the change in control from family-held corporations that publish newspapers to publicly held companies that are, in many cases, parts of larger conglomerates that are answerable, as I said, to Wall Street, have really changed the complexion of how and you know, local newspaper not accepted. How newspapers are covering the news. That focus on the bottom line means that budgets are being cut. It means that the most vulnerable positions include newsroom positions. Those are being cut. What does that mean? That there's fewer people in the newsroom. They have more to do. They have less attention to give to specific issues. Things aren't getting covered in depth the way they should be. A great report on this issue, by the way, was issued recently by a group that is based right here in Missoula, the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources, that did a study that is called, Matching the Scenery, Journalism's Duty to the North American West, that made these points in regard to reporting on the environment and land use issues, but the same points could as well be made about reporting on any issues. So those business interests are an enormous factor in the way that news is covered and made today.
Thank you. We have an interesting question here related to that. Someone is reporting that High Country News reports this week that 58 out of the 100 Bush administration rollbacks of environmental laws occurred on Friday afternoons. The question is, coincidence or manipulation of the media? I think it kind of answers itself.
I don't need an answer.
Yeah. Clem, you were talking about the changes in the control of media from family-held businesses to conglomerates answerable to Wall Street. And this is a chart. Mike, would you mind closing that, zooming out a little bit so we can see? This is from the Media Reform Center. It shows that in 1993, 50 corporations controlled the vast majority of the news media in the U.S., and that number had fallen to 6 by 2000. So we're moving on to this next sort of topic here, which is talking about the concentration of media. The FAIR website says this concentration of ownership tends to reduce the diversity of media voices and puts great power in the hands of a few companies. As news outlets fall into the hands of large conglomerates with holdings in many industries, conflicts of interest inevitably interfere with news gathering. Mark Crispin Miller, a New York University professor and media critic, characterizes the situation in this way. While the players come and go, the domination of the media by entertainment conglomerates exerts a consistently corrosive effect on journalism, undermining debate in this country just when we need it the most. So as you're talking, as we're talking about the people who make up the media who are to follow these code of ethics, the question is, who is covered by these journalistic codes of ethics? Does it include the CEO like Rupert Murdoch, as well as the journalists who are involved in all aspects of gathering, transmitting, disseminating, and commenting on the news of the day? Does anybody have a good sense of if that discussion?
It's an anachronism. In the corporate world, to talk about a code of ethics and a responsibility on any level is an anachronism because it simply doesn't exist anymore. What does exist is the single commitment to the bottom line. A corporation's responsibility is to turn a profit for its stockholders, period. And it's not to say that the corporations are somehow exerting control on local papers. They're political control. They're in fact apolitical. They don't care. They would do an updated version of the Daily Worker in Missoula if they thought it would turn a profit. The point is, they really don't care. They honestly don't. The one thing that they do care about is the bottom line. That's every corporation's job. And it's no different if you're making cars or selling newspapers. And it just so happens that the formula for doing that, for making a profit, guts journalism. fine, they'll go ahead and do that, and readers are fully complicit in it because they're the consumer society, and that's how they make money off you guys. And so don't worry about political agendas of these guys. What's really happening is there is one rule in a corporation: you show a profit.
Anybody else?
Honestly, I don't think that most codes of ethics that are promulgated by journalistic organizations are worth the paper they're printed on. I think they're paid lip service to by people. I don't think that there's an awful lot of attention paid to them by the organizations. That doesn't mean that there isn't a place for ethics. That's not at all what I'm saying. I think that every editor's and reporter's responsibility is to adhere to that organization or individual code of ethics. And the way that is practiced day to day is what matters, not whether there's something written down on a piece of paper. But ultimately, how much control do you want a code of ethics to have over reporters, on the other hand? Do you want it enforceable by the government? I doubt it. Ultimately, it has to be something that's self-enforcing, that's from journalists and for journalists. I guess I'll stop there. I'm sure that Denny has something to say on this.
Well, I'm finding myself agreeing with Clem, which is nice. And I guess I'd like to point out to Dick that there's something special about the news business. There's something different about making news as compared to making widgets, and that's the fact that it's the only business protected by the First Amendment. We give news business a special privilege because what they make is so important. And that's why I use medical analogies when I talk about journalism, because journalism is the lifeblood of a democratic society. But having said that, well, I do think that there are important things to be said about code of ethics, and they do apply to everybody who's involved in making the news, CEO down to the cub reporter, that expecting a code of ethics to motivate good journalism is like expecting a marriage license to motivate a cheating spouse to be faithful.
Okay. We have a follow-up question. Are there differences between the United States and European journalism regarding manipulation of the media?
Manipulation of the media?
Anybody have any experience?
There's big differences. I'm not so sure in terms of what you mean by manipulation, but for example, European attitudes toward objectivity are very different. And you will see, for example, opinion pieces by reporters who cover their beats. And because they know their beat, and they're able to comment on it, and it's side by side with the news. It may, it's not going to be in a different section, and oftentimes, and you'll see this a lot in British journalism, you will see a lot more opinion. There's just a different attitude about this, sacrosanct question of objectivity, whatever that means. So, that's only one example of many differences between the sort of established model of American journalism and other forms of journalism. Manipulation, I'm not sure exactly what that difference might be.
There's also a difference, I think an important difference in terms of accountability systems with European journalism, in that there is a more clear and explicit way for the public to have voice when they have arguments, whether it's ombudspeople or news councils there's some place for people to go when they're frustrated with the press, and it's not that way in the U.S.
There's some cultural differences, too, in terms of the audience. I mean, the Europeans are generally better educated, far more literate, and better readers. The French, for instance, read books like we can only dream of. And that has a positive impact on the relationship between the press and its audience.
So maybe, Denny, you've already begun to answer this next question. This question is from someone in the audience, but I'd share it myself. What can the average citizen here do to demand a code of ethics? Like you said, in Europe, they have ombudsman and something. I mean, what can the average citizen here do? Any ideas?
Well, I think that because of the First Amendment, and by the way, there could be wonderful free press as there is in the world without First Amendments. You know, I mean, we've sort of grown up in this country to think that the First Amendment creates and protects a free press. The First Amendment creates and protects the kind of press that Dick was talking about, which isn't necessarily the best press. So I don't think that we're going to get the same kinds of accountability that work in some other countries. I think that there are some things that citizens can do, but that's what we're going to do at the end.
Yeah, we'll save that for the end, but for the synthesis part. But I think that's an important question.
Yeah.
We'll keep that on top.
Well, I'm
Go ahead.
not sure that I understand you, but if you mean that the First Amendment protects the corporate media, yes, it does, but it also protects the concept of democratic, small d, democratic participation in our society through the media.
I agree with that.
All right. Well, let's move on to the third part of Focus on Media, which is looking at a capacity that citizens have. Media literacy is the capacity to critically understand media, including how messages are constructed, framed, manipulated, and also what may be missing. So Denny is going to share with us some examples of how the same event can be covered differently by front page coverage. And I'm going to make sure I can see. Why is this not open?
Well, Teresa's bringing it up. Let me just say that some of the work that my partner Paul Lester and I do is in comparative coverage of news events. And one of the things I'm going to tell you is basically how you can do this too. I'm going to just do two examples, fairly recent examples, quickly, because I know that we need to move along here. The Elian Gonzalez story, you might remember that. And the question is whether Elian's being taken from his relative's home and reunited with his Cuban father, whether that was a raid or a reunion. It was actually Easter weekend 2000 that this occurred. And what this is a quick example of is same event, different interpretations. Newsweek emphasized the seizing of Elian. There's a little picture of Elian with Dad up there in the corner, but the big issue is literally seizing Elian. It's the raid. Contrast that, go ahead next, with Time magazine, Papa. Here the focus is on the reunion part of it. Yes, we have a little picture of the raid in the bottom, but the story from Time magazine's perspective is the kid getting home to his dad. Now, which story is true? Well, they both are. Let's take a look at how some newspapers covered it. Some newspapers put the reunion on top, and it really worked. I mean, we've actually did an analysis of 20 different front pages on this story, and it was interesting to see how they worked so hard to balance some of them. Let's go to the next one, the LA Times. You'll notice that at the top of the page, they balance both in the picture size and the headline, which says, Elian Dad reunited after raid. So we get both concepts together. In fact, the LA Times photo folks told us that they went so far as to measure the size of the faces to make sure that they were balancing the two. And then there was the Missoulian. I've got to tell you that in terms of the continuum that we put these papers on, the Missoulian was at one end with "we're taking you," which is actually a truncated quote that was quite problematic. What the officer said, not the guy with the gun, but the woman that's in civilian clothes who grabbed the little kid and went running out with him, said, "Don't worry, we're taking you to Papa."
Can I interrupt for just a second? Because that headline style in the Missoulian was one of the examples that was dictated by corporations. The corporate control in Davenport decided that that headline style would prevail, including that font and that size headline, to size them up. The directive came down in the late 80s, was fought viciously by the local staff, who worked very hard to get rid of it, and in the end, they actually flew in people from Davenport to actually redo the paper one night, repaste up the paper with that new headline style and that kind of breathiness in the headlines. It was literally dictated by Davenport.
Interesting.
So they were responsible for the dies.
Those kinds of things, absolutely. They came straight out. It was not some editor thought that up. That was actually came out of Davenport, and it was corporate policy.
Well, actually, talking to Mike McAnally about this headline, he at least told us and was quoted in our story as that was a mistake. That, you know, that truncated headline that changed the meaning of what was being said was unacceptable.
His bosses didn't think it was a mistake.
Okay, next, and again, another example is what we call the liberation occupation question. This is the toppling of the Saddam Hussein statue, April 12th, I think it was. And this is, again, at one end of the continuum where we have the liberation of Saddam is coming down. You know, we see the clear Baghdad style, you know, I mean, the presence behind, no American involvement at all. This is a liberation photo. Next. Here we have a little involvement with a little soldier and flag and Saddam. But again, it's, you know, the big focus, big pictorial focus, and the headline, "Down Goes Saddam." Next. Here we have the U.S. figuring more prominently in the toppling. Next. Here we have the focus. Oops. Is that the next one? Okay. Yeah.
Want me to go back?
Yeah, go back one, please. Okay. We've got Saddam. Okay, or rather, we've got the soldier in a big pictorial presence. Next. Yeah. The crouched cheer is ministry seized. And we have a textual interpretation that's giving primary focus to the U.S. while we see Saddam come down. And then at the last one, we've got, or not next to the last one rather, we've got the soldier putting the flag on Saddam's face, a very strong focus on the American occupation. And last of all, we've got the big soldier, big flag, and with the focus this time being almost primarily on the U.S. occupation. Again, which of these stories and presentations are true? The question, or the point is that to some extent they all are, and it is up to citizens to be able to get that full story. This actually particular little piece of the presentation was something put together by Paul Lester that he uses in his visual communication class. But all of the newspapers, all of the front pages came from the Poynter Institute website. Every one of us can go to www.poynter.org on any day that there's a major event like this and take a look at front pages from around the world.
And that is on the resource list when you leave, so you don't have to worry that you didn't
So we
get the
all
stuff.
have access to getting these different notions on how to tell the story.
Thank you, Denny. Before we go to conversation, let's look at another example of variance in reporting content. And in this case, we have a measure of how it can affect the perceptions of the viewing audience. So I'm going to move to the Elmo graphic right here. Okay. So can you guys see that? Okay. Mike, can you zoom out on that one? A little bit more would be good. There we go. So this graph shows some of the results of a recent study, which it's an October 2003 study by the Program on International Policy, PIPA or PIPA, at the University of Maryland, and others helped participate. What they found was widespread misconceptions, like you were talking about, Denny, about the events surrounding the war in Iraq, including weapons of mass destruction, whether Saddam Hussein had anything to do with the 9/11 tragedy and so forth. What they found was that the frequency of the misconceptions correlated with an individual's primary source of news. Those who primarily watched Fox News, we need to pull that up a little bit there. There we go. Those who primarily watched Fox News were significantly more likely to have misconceptions, in sharp contrast to lower rates among those who turned to National Public Radio or public television for news. And they also found that those who had held misconceptions before and after the war were far more likely to be supportive of using military force in Iraq. So we see the direct results of misconceptions. So turning to our panel, the question is, and you can use it or ignore it, how is it that news coverage can vary so drastically, with some companies consistently failing to meet standards of truth in reporting? And what is the ultimate effect on our democracy, especially perhaps in times of decision-making about war, for example, when lives are at stake?
I really think that we ought to think of that in terms of a symptom of a deeper problem, and that we are in a culture war in this country right now. We've been in a culture war since the 1960s, and it is becoming as pitched now as religious warfare has been in other countries as we've watched societies degenerate. And one of the reasons is the press or the media can vary so greatly is because we're self-selecting now. In other words, we go to watch Fox News because it takes care of our preconceptions. That's what we want to hear. What we believe somehow matters. And so we're facing a right wing in this country that is interested in watching propaganda. That's what it is. I mean, I don't like television, but I kind of bit my lip and turned my satellite back on during the Iraq War to watch it, and promptly turned it off about 2 weeks later, because it was propaganda. And Fox News, CNN, MSNBC were simply spouting government lines. And they were not doing it because they were propagandists. They were doing it because what their viewers wanted to hear. They wanted their preconceptions bolstered. So it's not about information any longer. It's a religious exercise. And we go there to go like we're going to a pep rally. That's what it's really all about now.
I'd like to pick up on what Richard said, because it sounds so pessimistic.
I am pessimistic.
And I'm not, because I think that part of what, complaining about the media is one thing, and complaining about the government is one thing, but one of the things that we all have here is the power of citizenship. And a duty of citizenship is to seek out other opinion. One of my favorite philosophers, British philosopher from the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, would have loved the World Wide Web because it allowed what he said that we have a duty as citizens to do, and that's to seek out unpopular opinion, try to understand the biases of the people who don't agree with us, and we have that opportunity now. And it's our job as citizens not to do what Richard is saying that so many citizens do, and that's turn on the station that reflects what we like. But it's okay to do that, but we also need to understand the other side in the culture war to bridge that divide.
That's precisely the schism that exists. That's exactly how we can define the culture wars. There's one side that says what I believe is what matters. That's my preconception. There's another side that wants to look at information as an iterative process. In other words, when I read the New York Times every day, I want to disagree with part of it, because I know I'm still alive, I'm still engaged, right? Really, because you're still a critical reader. You're still there. I'm proud of the fact I can change my mind. And that's really where the line is drawn in our culture right now. It's a line of religion. Okay? And
Dogma.
It's dogma. It's dogma. And we have fundamentalists essentially don't want their beliefs challenged, and others do want their beliefs challenged because that's how we learn, that's how we grow, that's how we know things. That line is not something we can repair. That's why we're in a culture war.
As I hear this, it also makes me wonder whether we're passing right now in kind of the shadow or the edge of the end of a age of journalism in which if we were to look back on, let's say 200 or 300 years from now, might seem to have been a relatively short period in which the values of so-called objectivity, fairness, and balance, don't snicker, were among the most highly valued among those journalism values. If you go back farther, let's say to the colonial period, the newspapers that were published then were unabashedly biased in the sense of taking one position or another without trying to make any kind of value judgment. Is not something like Fox News a modern iteration of that kind of bias? And if we take what Dick was just talking about, this war of dogma, this so-called, or I wouldn't call it so-called, but you can label it as a religious war. If these values are, let's say, more predominant, then perhaps we are passing into an age in which the Fox Newses of the world will predominate more, that people will turn to them because they do value, because they do echo their own thoughts and opinions. This is just a kind of a philosophical statement, really. If you were to look back 200 or 300 years, from now, maybe that's what you'd see.
Did you get to comment, Denny? Am I following this?
Go ahead.
Okay, if so, I just wanted to read a question here related to Fox News, seems to be the topic. Recently, a reporter brought suit against Fox for having been forced to represent the news in an evening broadcast after. I'm sorry. Did I say that? Okay, I'll read that again. Recently, a Fox News reporter brought a suit against her former employer for having been forced to misrepresent the news in an evening broadcast. After two lower courts found against Fox News, an appeal to a higher court found in favor of Fox, saying that the First Amendment protected the right of Fox to lie with impunity. Any comment? Same old?
I hope it gets to the Supreme Court and gets overturned. I mean, I know something about it, but I hadn't followed that appeal. I mean, it's not okay for things that call themselves journalism or news organizations to lie with impunity. No, it's not.
Well, we have laws about that. They're libel laws, essentially. And when you go beyond that, you get into regulation issues. And those are just as spooky to me sometimes. In other words, what the government tells you how you're to report something or how do you slant a news story or something like that, that's every bit as spooky.
Right, but I mean, it's not okay for the government to manipulate the news as it is. I agree with that. But nor is it okay for a media owner to say, we will not report these truths because it'll make our friends look bad.
It's legally okay. It's legally okay, and it ought to be. It ought to be. That's what freedom of the press is all about. That we have libel laws. In other words, you can't lie about a person and damage a person, but you can lie. You can lie. And that's as it should be. Because ultimately, the readers are the judge of that, not laws, not courts. And so that freedom exists to distort. That's why I talk about active readership, because you have to engage what you're reading every day and expect that people are distorting, expect they are lying to a degree. The alternative to that is government regulation, and I think that's every bit as onerous.
Well, no, the alternative to that is responsible journalism.
Right, but you can't force that.
No, you can't force it. Well,
That's
actually,
what you're
yeah,
suggesting.
you're right.
You're
No, you're right.
suggesting.
I am saying that there is a line
Yeah.
where it's okay.
But I think it's healthy to expect a certain amount of responsible journalism, or irresponsible journalism. It's healthy to expect that and know that it's out there. Because, you know, even getting into complexity theory, I mean, error is always good for a system. But it keeps us on our toes. And it's less likely we can be lied to if we distrust everything we read, to a degree.
You know,
But
if,
error is different from intent to lie.
Yeah, I know that. I know that.
going back to Fox News, if they want to promote themselves as, you know, reactionary news 24/7,
That's
well,
what they do.
fine.
Go.
You know,
Yeah.
then people, you know, that's a place where people can go and get their reactionary news. But of course, to promote themselves as fair and balanced is quite a different matter.
Now, that's the
And they've
lie.
registered as a copyright, by the way.
And so now we move
Right.
on to
Yeah.
a mixture of the discussion of media and government, partly with this is more a clarification on the part of an audience member than a question, pointing out that the toppling of that Saddam statue was not what it appeared to be. I mean, that hasn't been mentioned yet. So this is another layer of manipulation, that the participants were sent there by the U.S. setting up the governing council. Followers were not off the streets. The U.S. military had surrounded the square and limited access to the site by average Iraqis. Is this not an example of propaganda campaign? And I know there's places on the web where you can find that. But obviously the media, most of the media didn't report that, and that was set up by the government in the form of the military. So let's look at the role of the government now and its role in protecting a free press. We're introducing a new idea, not defining, but protecting a free press in terms of access and so forth. There seems to be a great deal of dissatisfaction among the press among some press with what's happening in the administration. Mike Allen, in a Washington Post feature on March 7th of this year, recounts that President Bush's solo press conference on March 8th was scripted and controlled because, as White House Communications Director Dan Bartlett explained, if you have a message you're trying to deliver, a news conference can go in a different direction. Bartlett explained that they knew what the questions were going to be, and those were the ones we want to answer, unquote. In September 2003, the Los Angeles Times reported how Attorney General John Ashcroft restricted print journalists from joining the audiences in Buffalo and Philadelphia, where he was making his tour to promote the Patriot Act. The Secret Service physically barred print journalists, and Ashcroft himself refused to speak to them. He did allow local television coverage and gave television interviews, as this was his preferred mode of getting his message out to the American people without any filters, is what he said. And if you go on the web, as I have and been looking around, including every Wednesday, there's a Peace and Justice show of documentaries here at the university. There are many books, articles, documentaries, speeches, news commentary focusing on how the media and the citizens are being manipulated, such as we've talked about this evening. Many point to deception and misinformation about military actions taken not only during this administration, but many previous administrations. This last Sunday, the former Vice President Al Gore spoke to 3,000 people about the folly of the military invasion in Iraq, as well as the assault on our civil liberties, all in the name of fighting terrorism. He said, "In both cases, the administration has fostered false impressions and misled the nation with superficial, emotional, and manipulative presentations that are not worthy of American democracy." Larry Klayman, who is the chairman of Judicial Watch, has stated, "This administration is the most secretive of our lifetime, even more secretive than the Nixon administration. They don't believe the American people or Congress have the right to information. So panelists, how do you make sense of the actions of the current administration in regards to the press and others' dissatisfaction with the treatment?
I read Gore's speech today, and I think it's well worth reading because it's really I think a serious, pretty level-headed criticism of the administration. Of course, you have to factor in politics, but one of the points that Gore makes is maybe like a lot of points that he makes is a little more subtle, and that has to do with the change in direction or the change in emphasis by this administration on the Freedom of Information Act, and it's a very fundamental change, just like a shift in the burden of proof that you might see in court. Basically, the presumption there has been since the FOI Act was enacted, a presumption of openness, meaning that documents are open and available to the public unless there is unless it fits within an exception. Well, the Bush administration's directive in using Homeland Security as an excuse is to mandate that government agencies must first, well, basically now there's a presumption that documents are closed unless there is a good reason to give them to the public. An agency has to actively examine every possible excuse or reason for keeping the documents closed. That is a major change in the way that the Freedom of Information Act is regarded by the administration, and therefore the way in which it will be administered and the way in which the press and citizens will be able to get information. So that's not a terribly sexy subject, but access to the government is just extraordinarily important. You may have all read recently of the audit that was done in this state by newspapers of access to public documents that was conducted by newspapers around the state, what was called a FOI audit, and basically a test of how open public government is. The results, if you were to cast them in terms of exam grades, would be that most public agencies got an A- and law enforcement got an F. Sheriffs and law enforcement officers basically thumbed their noses at the laws, which are very explicit, the Constitution and the laws in Montana, which are very explicit about open records and access to records, and basically said, come and get it, or I'm just not going to release it. You're going to have to sue me for it. Just openly flaunting the law in some cases. So that's a local example of the importance of access to citizen and press access to public information. Not really on the point of manipulation, except that it is a way in which the government can manipulate information obviously by not releasing it.
Thank you.
I'd like to talk about this a little bit in terms of whose job it is to fix it. And what can the government do to fix this? Nothing. Okay, that's not the point. You expect governments to behave this way. The government is always your enemy when you're a reporter. You should treat them that way. But I want to talk about whose fault that is. I mean, does anybody here ever remember the name I.F. Stone? Right? I.F. Stone was this great guy during the Nixon administration. He was a journalist, and he was deaf. And as a result of being deaf, he couldn't go to press conferences. So he couldn't go to the usual reporter hangouts and all those things and trade lies. So he had no access to government. And as a result, he was one of the best government reporters that ever existed. He put out his own independent newsletter, and he broke more stories during that era than any other reporter that existed because he refused the access trade with government. And if you could get out of the Nixon administration that information, you can certainly get it out of this administration. This administration is controlling information to a degree bordering on fascism. We've not seen anything like it ever. It's repulsive. But the reason they're able to get away with it is because there are no I.F. Stones today. That the reporters have become part of that inner circle of government. They are the permanent government now, and they trade their integrity for access. Because they can go to the administration every day and they get those background phone calls and they get that information that gets them a little higher on the food chain in network journalism, then they're willing to keep their mouth shut about the important stories. And if you want a test case of that, look at the Novak column about the Wilson outing, right? The CIA agent who was outed in the Novak column. There are 6 reporters who know the answer to that. 6 reporters who know the answer of who did that, who committed a felony. And if a Democrat had done it, there would be big trouble right now. But those reporters are keeping their mouths shut to preserve their access, because that's their stock in trade. And that's who can fix it, the people who are willing to be I.F. Stones.
I'd like to just, I guess, agree. In terms of saying that I think that who's going to fix this is, yes, we can wait for the I.F. Stone, or we can depend on the citizens, because government's not going to fix it, media's not going to fix it. And so I actually would just like to read a one-paragraph statement of the democratic ideal, because I think it helps us as citizens to remember what this is supposed to be about. And this is from my graduate school mentor, philosopher Israel Scheffler. He says, "The democratic ideal is that of an open and dynamic society, in that there's no antecedent social blueprint, which is itself to be taken as dogma, immune to critical evaluation. Dynamic in that its fundamental institutions are not designed to arrest change, but to order and channel it by exposing it to public scrutiny and resting it ultimately upon the choices of its members. This kind of society sustains itself not by the indoctrination of myth, but by the reasoned choices of its citizens, who continue to favor it in light of critical scrutiny, both of it and its alternatives. It's our job to fix this."
I got a quote to top that.
Fine.
This is from Thomas Jefferson. "There is only one force in the nation that can be depended upon to keep the government pure and the governors honest, and that is the people themselves. They alone, if well informed, are capable of preventing the corruption of power and of restoring the nation to its rightful course if it should go astray. They alone are the safest depository of the ultimate powers of government."
Okay, I want to follow that up with a question, which is something that's already been brought up, but I think it's an important follow-through. You talked about I.F. Stone. He sounds like, I don't know about him, but he's like a hero in terms of bringing things out. And I'm wondering, what is the fate, and this is the question, what is the fate of investigative reporters at the national level in this day and age who want answers from the administration rather than just to serve as scribes for the soundbite of the day? Given that citizens, it's our job, but we don't have access, we're not reporters.
Let me give an answer to that just briefly, if you don't mind. There's a huge difference between a class of journalists that we might say dwell inside the Beltway and, as Dick said, trade access. There's a huge difference between people like that and people who in fact, ply the craft of investigative journalism and investigative reporting. And there is almost no better example than is exemplified by the work of a reporter who is here on campus this semester, Maurice Posley of the Chicago Tribune, who is one of the reporters who was most responsible for the extensive reporting on DNA exonerations and the lifting of, exoneration of people who had been on death row because they were wrongfully convicted. Not him alone, but several reporters worked on literally dozens of stories that looked at police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, and ways in which that had resulted in wrongful convictions. That kind of shoe leather work is the salvation of journalism. Unfortunately, that kind of work takes time and money, and that's exactly the kind of reporting, that's exactly the kind of journalism that gets sliced and diced by corporate budget number crunchers.
It's the first thing to go, the first casualty. I mean, the Missoulian in the early 80s was known in the West for committing and giving reporters months, literally months, to work on investigative stories. That all died. But what Clem said about the inside the Beltway, outside the Beltway brings to mind, Woodward and Bernstein were cop reporters, right? They were just lowly weekend beat reporters, and the most grief they took was from within their own paper, and the people who were actually on White House press corps. But that's not to say that investigative journalism is in trouble at all in the country. There's still some good work being done. If you haven't been following Cy Hirsch for the last 6 months in the New Yorker, you've really missed a lot of what's been going on in Iraq. If you missed the Times front page story about 3 days ago about the Iraqis' offer to settle with a peace plan prior to the war, you missed some really good investigative reporting. It's out there, and it's, in fact, Cy Hirsch has a column in the New Yorker this week, Talk of the Town, talking about 2 investigative reporters in, I think, Ohio, who broke a story about massacres in Vietnam and what happened to their story and the inability of the rest of the press to pick up on their story. It's a really good case study of what happens to investigative reporting. It's happening, but it's not getting the attention it once did.
I want to try and get a sense from the audience how much there's already knowledge of the FCC decision on June 2nd and the subsequent actions in Congress. We're a little behind the time set, and I wanted to make sure we have time for the synthesis part. You know what I'll do is, anybody really wants to watch a 5-minute video, I'll play it right after we finish here. It's a very good overview. 60 people saw it yesterday already at the League of Women Voters, so out of respect for them, they don't want to see it 2 days in a row. But maybe we could comment on that. What I'm hearing you say is that we're losing our investigative reporters, partly with the growth of the conglomerates that are out for the bottom line, not interested in investigative journalism. Is there anything more to the complexity of that situation, besides the fact that I know the Senate is, at least yesterday, was in the process of debating this issue, and it's a good time to call your senators and let them know what you think about it. Does anybody have any kind of general comment, or do you want me to pose a question? We have a pretty good question here. Ready? Okay, the question is, should media be managed by market forces alone, or does it deserve special protection as a public trust under the First Amendment?
Well, I mean, since I've already made the point that making news is different from making automobiles or widgets, I would argue that the First Amendment protections imply certain responsibilities. And so when we talk about fairness doctrine or control of media ownership, so that we allow and maintain different voices, I think that that's an important piece of having a diverse free press.
The First Amendment is not a restrictive law. It is an enabling law that gives the press certain freedoms. But, of course, as Denny said, along with those freedoms come certain obligations. Capitalism and market forces don't impose any restrictions. If you look at capitalism theory, there aren't any restrictions on how much money you can make or what you do to get it. So that's just that's a different concept. That's a different system. And the news media in our country exist within both of those simultaneously. And I don't really think there's necessarily a problem with that theory. It's the way that it's abused that I see problems with.
I'm an anarchist about it, and I believe that once you start protecting, as I argued earlier, that you get into some issues. But also the other problem is it focuses our attention on something that I think is way too narrow of a definition of the media. So we think of the corporations and who's disseminating. I mean, how many of you have ever emailed a press clip to somebody else? You know, we do that all the time. Congratulations, you're in the media business. You're a newspaper now. I mean that literally, because that's what we do. Okay? So you're disseminating information. The First Amendment applies to all of us. And it's that responsibility when it devolves to everybody's shoulders to create an informed discussion is, I think, a better way to recognize that. And we all now have the power to do that. I mean, because of the internet, because of the incredible power of controlling information and disseminating information, we have that power. And so if we talk about regulating, and protecting all those things, I think it's going to miss the emphasis we need, which is how we seize power that's out there, technical power, and use that to the advantage to once again enliven a citizenry.
Okay. Well, let's move into the synthesis. We have lots of questions which Mike and Jane are categorizing here. This piece that's on the overhead here is something that you can find on the web, and the reference for it, it's the top 8 media ownership, and it talks about they've already exceeded the cap that was set by the FCC, and they're part of the group vying, their lobbyists and lawyers are part of the group that have been vying for more access and more cross-ownership with all its implications. So there's lots of information on the web, and again, senators are debating that issue. Over almost 1 million people, called the FCC before it, and I understand another 1 million after, and Congress may or may not be listening. So in terms of moving into the synthesis, it maybe is the most important thing that we're going to do tonight in terms of trying to put this together, make sense. Where do we go from here? What is the next step after this conversation for those who want to make a difference? And it's a time to share practical ideas. We're going to read some of the questions here, but it's also appropriate for people to raise their hands, and I'll call on them. But I want to begin. There's so many questions, and you have them on your list here. If any of those questions appeal to you, I don't feel like picking out any one of these questions. I'm not really sure how to proceed here, but one thing that we can do, if Marianne, we could take notes on the board. If people just want to share ideas at this point, brainstorming. Questions? Okay, so let's take a question here from the audience, and go ahead, sir.
Actually, I'd like to recommend first a couple of authors and some websites. Speak louder. I'd like to recommend a couple of authors and websites to everybody. The author by the name of David Icke, his last name is spelled I-C-K-E. He's done about 14 years of research into the depth to the complexity of what's going on, and it is much more complicated than I think any of us even realize. Also, there's a website called FromTheWilderness.com, and that's put on by a guy named Michael Rupert. He used to be in the LAPD, and he was forced out in 1977 for exposing the CIA for running drugs. Anyway, we could talk for hours about the complexities, but I think what's most important for all of us is to realize that until we take personal responsibility as an individual for what's going on, then it's going to continue to get worse and worse, and yes, we are living in a fascist state right now. So we need to take personal responsibility, and we also need to realize that the answers do not lie with fighting, because what they're selling us is fear. They want us to be in fear, and they want us to fight each other. What we need to do is realize that the answers to all these questions are in ourselves, and that the only answer is for us to be loving to people and the world around us. This has been going on since long before any of us in this room were ever born, and the reason I strongly recommend David Icke's work is because he has taken the time and the personal responsibility to do intense research about what's really going on. You know, yes, the Bush administration, in my view, is behind 9/11. They made it happen. They wanted it to happen. Saddam Hussein and all the people involved, they're all part of the same network of controlling filthy rich people who
Okay.
are controlling the world. So
Thank you, sir.
let's make ourselves aware.
And I really want to limit it to questions. I'm sorry, I got distracted here reading other questions. I'm going to just read a few of them here and see if it can generate some reaction on the part of the panel. Okay, so this is the first. Is the complexity boom of the information age making our citizen duty more and more difficult, on the verge of impossible? The next question here. How does a reader know if the various media sites on the internet are factual? It seems like some of them are pushing an agenda. Another related question is, what media sources do you recommend to the average citizen for accurate news reporting? And again, we do have references to some of the most popular websites on a sheet as people leave, and you can hook on to that and link easily. And then someone's asking, what are the president and the media trying to do by spreading propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation? I find it hard to believe the sole intention is money. What do you think?
Are we going to answer all those at once?
This is
One
okay.
answer to all the questions.
A lot of fodder now. Now you can respond. I won't read any more.
Can I just say, I want to follow up on something that Clem said earlier, and that's this notion of objectivity. I think that, first of all, that being a literate consumer of media and an educated citizen means understanding that everyone's got an agenda. Objectivity was one of those words that we now talk about as an ethical term for news media, but it came about through marketing practice. When the wire services started trying to sell their messages to a larger and more, and a broader audience, not suddenly, but over time, the journalistic value became objectivity, became something that would appeal to a broader audience. It's okay to surf the web knowing that everyone's got an agenda. What's important is that you take in as many of those different messages as possible and then form your own educated opinion out of that.
Yeah, I've been thinking in this terms of a personal paradox, and I got to address Denny's worries earlier about my pessimism. Because, and a paradox gets at that, because you've heard me lament the state of the press these days and be pretty pessimistic about it. But the paradox is that I'm better informed than I've ever been. And I've got more information and more, I think, solid information than I ever had before. I can read an unlimited number of newspapers every day. And before, it wasn't but 5 years ago I could hope to get a copy of the New York Times 5 days late. Right? Now, it's not necessarily bad to have it 5 days late. It's just the way it was. But I can read the Post and I read the Times, and they're great papers to this day. They're great newspapers. The point of that is we've got a bunch more information than we had before. We have power. And it's learning how to exercise that power. I happen to be a reporter. I'm a journalist. And I know how to exercise that power. And believe me, this thing is like firing up a rocket ship every day. My personal computer has literally the power of half of that newspaper building over there. And by half of the building, I mean that half of their budget. They used to pay to do the things that I can do on my personal computer today. That's mind-boggling. I wouldn't have believed it could happen 10 years ago. We just haven't learned how to use that power, and I think that that's where we are. That's the critical juncture that we're at right now, and that's where the power lies with this group, with people who are thinking about these issues. You got it at your fingertips. You got to learn how to use it and use it effectively.
There's this huge conundrum that I have never been able to figure out. In my research that I've been doing on my book, I've looked into World War I quite extensively. This was a period when really the only mass medium was newspapers. There was no radio, there was no television, or obviously other modern media. To turn the public in favor of the war, Wilson created an agency, a government agency called the Committee for Public Information within a week after war was declared. And that agency, in effect, became a domestic propaganda agency that created a favorable climate for war by manipulating every form of media, not only newspapers, of course, but the new medium of cinema and art, posters and things like that. Used every medium possible, exploited techniques that are now so familiar to us in public relations and advertising that they are ingrained, we don't even recognize them. Okay, so you've got this situation in 1917, 1918, where the government was able to essentially turn a nation that was pretty much against the war into a nation that was rabidly in favor of the war and against the Huns and so forth, and therefore favored by a vast margin the concept of political suppressing political dissent in this country. Okay? But basically, the media of communication were very limited. And people, you might expect, were easily manipulated by the government using these media, limited media. Today, we have unlimited media in terms of, the internet and all of that. And yet, it's just as easy for the government, as Denny was mentioning, in terms of images, in terms of planting ideas about that have absolutely no basis in fact of who was responsible for the 9/11 events. The conundrum is that today, with all of our vast resources that we individually have at our disposal, we are still as easily manipulatable, whatever that word is.
Manipulated.
That's the conundrum. And if anybody can solve that, I'd sure like to know.
We've been hearing a lot this evening about freedom of the press. I'm interested in freedom of dissent. When you refer to World War I, one of the things that Woodrow Wilson had at his disposal was the Sedition Act in 1917. It wasn't only propaganda going out, but the ability of the government to take even very prominent people like Eugene Debs, of course, and throw them in prison for making public statements that opposed official policy. So I'd like to hear your ideas on perhaps perceptions or just some feedback, I guess, on the concern over the war on dissent. Because if only one voice is heard, it doesn't matter how many sources we hear from. If you only hear one voice, there's only one thing to believe. And so freedom of the press is great. Freedom of dissent is the other concern I'd like to see addressed.
Well, you know where that sedition law originated, of course, right here in Montana. That law was copied by Congress, essentially. You know, today, we may not have a sedition law, but we have a Patriot Act. We have, in the wings, possibly, Patriot Act 2, another law called the Victory Act. Who knows what that is, but they all represent possible ways of stifling political dissent.
But I don't think that it's even just the government doing it. I mean, if you take a look at the coverage of the anti-war movement just prior to the Iraqi war, the last Iraqi war, or the last Gulf War, and compare that to how the government and the sending the troops over, how that was covered. I mean, what you see is a true imbalance, and I think that some of what's necessary is for journalists to realize, again, that they need to be a third voice. It's that they can't simply be repeating government messages. They can't simply be reflecting patriotic feelings of the people, of course, because there's a vicious cycle there as well, too, with the government. But we need a third independent voice that isn't echoing either side, but is giving us yet a third perspective on how to view the world. And that means covering things that maybe Americans don't want to hear about.
And I think that's the real issue. I mean, who's censoring right now? Who's censoring the press? I think it's the public. And, you know, watching the Iraqi war coverage, it seemed to me that the people who were doing the censoring were more afraid of their viewers than anybody else, that they would turn on them. And that goes back to a whole bunch of polling that was done. I mean, you think politicians poll, you ought to see what's done inside of newspapers. They're constantly polling their readership and give the reader what they want to hear. Give the reader what they want to read. That's the ethic now. Because you're afraid that you'll lose that marginal readership, your readership will turn on you. We saw many times during the war that somebody would put up an image that the public didn't like, and then they report right afterwards how many jillions phone calls they got of people saying, we don't like to see that body, okay? We don't want to look at that anymore. And so that's the censorship, I think, is a public that doesn't want to be disturbed en route to the mall. You know, they want to go on with the consumer society and be able to fill up the SUV with gasoline and not a hell of a lot more than that.
Somebody have a question?
Yeah, there's a bumper sticker out called "Don't Believe Everything You Think." Now, I can find rational websites that say the 19 young men were set up. They're not Arabs. Somebody else did the hijacking. I can find a rational website that said a different kind of airplane hit the Pentagon. So these shifting, whispering sands of mentality.
Wait. Use the word rational. What's the basis for that? You mean they have proof? They have proof?
A lot of people believe it.
No. That's not rational. A lot of people believe, you know, a lot of screwy things. No, I try to prove things. And that's the definition of rational. You said rational. What's the proof?
Well, I'm just saying these ideas that are pushing back and forth like this are pretty limited. In the old days, when we were hippies, we said power to the people, but people have a very limited mentality. Isn't there something better that we can do than present these ideas that people think are true? You think a lot of things are true. Am I supposed to believe that you got the
It really doesn't matter what I think. Right? And Denny asked you guys what you thought or believe earlier on, and I hate that word, what you believe. I want to know what you know. I want to know what you can prove. And that's why I seized on the word rational. Okay? Because rationality is what we're all about in the end. It doesn't matter what you believe. It matters what you can show, what you can demonstrate, what you can prove, what is true. And that's how you learn how to see through these things, guys. You know, prove it to me, folks. You got it on your website, it's fact, and show me why it's true. Make it true. And if you read enough, and if you're rational, if you're engaged in logic, you can get there. You can cut through the bullshit. And that's why, don't call this website rational, please, if they don't have proof.
Right, and that, speaking of, again, that's what I'm calling the duty of citizenship, that our duty as individuals is to get as near to the truth as we can. And that means challenging our own ideas every way we can. And I'd love one of those bumper stickers.
Yeah.
You know, Oliver Wendell Holmes talked about the marketplace of ideas, and just looking at it in a non-commercial sense, the marketplace of ideas means putting ideas out there that people will consider. And there's nothing wrong with that.
We have a question here from Mike in the front, and then we have one final question.
Yeah, journalists, their role is to watchdog government. Well, what I'm gathering here is that we need to watchdog the journalists.
Sure.
Where is that happening? Or do you know of models? Are there media councils in communities? Or what kind of work is being done outside of groups like FAIR and some of these national level things? But I'm talking about like right here in Missoula. How do we go about this?
We're doing it right now.
No, we're sitting navel gazing right now. We're not doing anything right now. But where it's being done right now, the model for that is the Howard Dean campaign. Yeah, the Dean campaign, which is use of the internet and use of information, conversations that are occurring outside the mainstream and challenging the press corps dominance on presidential politics. And here's another way to look at that. You do it by exchanging information, you do it by competing. That if you're not really satisfied with what you're getting in the paper, or you think there's another story, put it out there. There are competing ways to go about this. And you can lobby until you turn blue in the face and write letters to the newspapers and all that stuff, and they'll put some nice window dressing on things. They're not going to change their ways. Fundamentally, you have to invent new ways to work around it. And that's how you create the watchdog. You just get the story out there. You shame them. You beat them on their own story. They hate it worse than anything.
Any other responses? So the question is democracy at risk? Given everything that we've seen tonight, what is your sense?
We do not live in a democracy. We live in an oligarchy. We have for quite some time now. That question's over with. The question is, can we regain it?
The question is again what?
The jury's out on that. Can we regain democracy?
Can we regain?
Democracy is not at risk. It's gone in this country. We live in an oligarchy. You have political access in the country if you have money. That is no longer a democracy. That's an oligarchy. That's ruled by the few. And the question is, can we regain it? And Denny said,
Yeah.
I don't know. That's an open question.
But that's but I think that you offered the kernels of how to go about that. It seems to me that there are some basic steps that we each not only have the power to do, but the responsibility as citizens to do. Research alternative information sites. From the question at the beginning of the time here, you're already doing that. We're already doing that. And then demand better news coverage from the mainstream media. Put in at least a couple of hours a month engaging the democratic process. So you're off the hook for this month. This is engaging in the democratic process is the point. Run for office, work for somebody who is, or at least ask your elected representatives what they're doing and why. Keep tabs on that. And then be incredulous that everybody you know isn't participating at the level you are. There's kind of an idea. I think that part of the reason our citizenry is so apathetic is because we see everyone being apathetic. We see everyone feeling powerless. And so if some of us, even those of us in this room, show what it means to be powerful and responsible, we set a model for people around us. And that's, I think, how we make a difference.
Thank you, Danny.
Well, I'll endorse that. I'll endorse that list. I'm not sure I'm willing to buy into Dick's judgment that we are even a functional oligarchy
I was being overly optimistic.
at this point. But assuming that we still do live and function in a democracy, why stop at the media? What about the whole education system? Why aren't people being educated about citizenry better in the schools? And it just educated in to be more literate citizens, as perhaps they might be in other countries. That whole thing, that whole discussion could consume another evening, obviously. But education, in and of itself, is a huge factor in citizen participation in a democracy. So there's just a lot of ways in which we as individuals can, help to make this a better society. As much of a cliche as that is, that's what any of us who values our citizenship in this country has an obligation to do.
Thank you very much. We have run out of time, and there's so much more that we could talk about, and there are sign-up sheets. If people want to continue this conversation in some way, there will be someone doing some follow-up work in some way, and people are welcome to sign that up. And I want to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for 2 hours of incredible communication. Thank you for coming.
Well, if they can tack on and see they're going to be 2 hours, they probably, if they're going to want to go over 2 hours and 10 minutes, but there was probably a couple of minutes at the beginning.
Cannot recommend anything, sorry.